Well, there were protests against lockdowns and mandates all over the Western world this weekend, in London, in Washington, across Europe, in Canada. And people should protest, as Lord Frost said on this show on Friday. It is a major public policy failure, if by public policy you mean stopping the virus. If instead you mean destroying life, normal life, family life, business life, it's been a huge success. Look at these guys getting the old tear gas and out on people protesting in support of normal life. Look at these guys. This has been a moral crime. These last 2 years have been a moral crime by the government against the governed. A lot of people get the lesson of King Canute wrong. Canute was, I think this was sort of circa 1016. He became King of England, if you don't do that in school anymore. Dates stick with me from many years ago. Canute was trying to teach his courtiers an important lesson in the limits of kingly power. So he ordered them to set his throne down at the seashore, and he commanded the incoming tide to stop. And instead, the tide came in and waterlogged his brogues, and he spent the rest of the day squelching around the palace. And his courtiers got the message: there are things even a king can't do. Today, we live in an age of literal Canutes. When he accepted the Democrat nomination for president, Obama declared that to future generations, this would be, quote, the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal. Well, the oceans declined to cease rising, even for Obama. So a decade later, Canute Johnson, a prime minister who cannot stop the tide of unvaxxed immigrants washing up on the southern shore in an age of lockdown, declares that if only we commit to net zero and the full COP26, the rise of the oceans will begin to slow. Definitely, for sure this time. You can take it to the bank. Why don't you try, relieving congestion on the M25? And if that works, then get back to me about changing the very heavens. In Her Majesty's Antipodean dominions, the Prime Ministers of Australia and New Zealand commanded the very virus to stop at the water's edge. And the result this day is that every single kangaroo and kiwi is hopping around dripping with Omicron. But if they can't control tides and viruses, they can control you. In the United Kingdom, according to the geniuses of Sage, this week was supposed to be peak Omicron, just before Christmas. They were predicting, I just want to make sure I've got these numbers right. They were predicting that right now we'd be seeing 600 to 6,000 deaths per day. The ICU's overwhelmed. All the usual rubbish that's been as wrong can be for the last 2 years. Except that this time the government said, what's the big deal, and decided not to play along. So here we are. And it's starting to feel a little different, isn't it? Opinions that not so long ago got you banned from Twitter and Facebook are now suddenly respectable. Oh yeah, the virus did come from that lab in Wuhan, like all the conspiracy theorists were saying 2 years ago. Turned out to be true. At the protests yesterday, one wag had a sign saying, "Did the BBC's credibility die of COVID or just with COVID?" Of COVID or with COVID. This was a distinction unrecognized by government statisticians for 2 years. In Orange County, Florida, a COVID-positive man in his 20s died in a motorcycle crash, but his death was added to the toll of the Wu flu because, as the chief medical officer put it, one, quote, could actually argue that it could have been the COVID-19 that caused him to crash. Has Putin got the Omicron? Is that why he's so eager to take Kiev? The only COVID-positive person to die of non-COVID was just mentioned by Polly in the news headlines just now, George Floyd in Minneapolis, because that's how far you had to go to get a death recorded as merely with COVID. Now, even Sajid Javid is saying the COVID corpse numbers were skewed. They weren't the only bogus numbers. The Treasury Minister, Lord Agnew, just quit because nothing's going to be done, he complained, about 5 billion quid in COVID business grants sluiced off by fraudsters. Right now, the Labour Party ought to be sitting pretty. The Tories are salivating for one of their once-in-a-generation acts of suicidal regicide, and Sir Keir is well positioned to be the dull, decent old stiff who inherits by default. But they don't get it, do they? Here's one of Labour's tweets on Partygate, which actually should not be called Partygate, but should actually be called "The last 2 years have been a disgraceful abuse of a once free people that have screwed everything in sight gate." But be that as it may, look at this. I remember 20th of May 2020 vividly. I spent hours on the phone to a man who was in the hospital car park, utterly desperate to see his wife. He begged, wept, shouted to be leapt in, but we said no for the greater good of everyone else. She died unexpectedly and alone, as the government had a party, says Jenny, a purported NHS nurse. Why is Keir Starmer holding up Nurse Jenny as a hero? There was no need to torment a poor man whose wife was dying. Why on earth would even the Labour Party venerate someone who does such a thing? That's the lesson of Partygate. Our rulers didn't follow the rules because they knew the rules were junk. And while Nurse Jenny was traumatising that fellow in the car park, no one was doing anything about the regime that actually inflicted all of this on the world. We were told we had to treat the pandemic like waging a war, but instead of doing a single thing to the enemy, Chairman Xi and his Politburo, cowardly Western governments preferred to wage war on their own peoples. True, signs of a COVID climb down are not universal. Jacinda Ardern's inmates in New Zealand have just been told that quarantine now means 24 days in isolation. And to show how responsible she is, she's postponed her own wedding. If you think 24 days of lockdown is tough, imagine what that poor guy... Oh, no, that would be terribly ungallant of me. Perhaps, after all, a great reckoning is coming for 2 years of human rubble being piled up. In notoriously litigious societies such as the United States, there will be the usual multi-gazillion-dollar lawsuits, but elsewhere, finger-in-the-windy politicians are beginning to grasp that the balloon of inflated COVID death statistics has been punctured, that the excess deaths from untreated cancer and heart disease will in the end be higher than COVID, that the mental health issues from 2 years of mask mandates, home confinements, and other institutionalized abuse of our children will be with us for the remaining years of this century, and that all this is the result of improper American research offshored by public health panjandrams to a dodgy lab in Wuhan. What do you reckon? You can email me,